Robert Maxwell sent me to survey a site for a potential university bookshop. I'd only been working for Robert Maxwell Bookshop at the Wainfleet as an assistant manager for no more than a few days when I suddenly, and indirectly, I can't remember who actually told me what I must do, but I was instructed to proceed without delay to Manchester to survey and give my opinion as to the possibilities of establishing a university bookshop there. I was to be accompanied by a man called Mr. Swadling. This is the first time I actually met him. He was an Oxfordshire guy, well built, with a very rich Oxfordshire accent. You can imagine the kind of person who, right back, son of the soil, as it were. Very intelligent, acute kind of guy, very resourceful. He was regarded as invaluable by Maxwell, I discovered later, a kind of general factotum. He did everything from chauffeuring to assignments and all kinds of things that needed to be done. Perhaps he was also interesting to Maxwell from the point of view that he was perhaps gave insight into how the man in the street thought. I don't know whether that's true, but it's a possibility. Anyway, I found myself in a car with Mr. Swadling, who I did get to know rather well at a future date. And we arrive in Manchester. Of course, I did know Manchester and the university bookshop scene there because I'd actually been the manager of the Sheraton Hughes University Bookshop. This was owned by W.H. Smiths, and they never really put much effort into the university bookshop, which was actually quite a small premises anyway, even though it was direct in front of Owens College. There was a reasonable stock, but a lot of the money was made at the beginning of the academic year for the sale of set books, which students at that time really had to buy a substantial number of books as the beginning of their courses. The other bookshop there was run by a guy called Ernest Hochland, I think was German. This was a very professional bookseller, probably German and probably trained in Germany, which has a very, very strong tradition of bookselling with very well trained people indeed. A polyglot, a well stocked shop, very well informed staff, etc., etc. So. A really, really good bookshop in general terms, and certainly is an academic bookshop of the first order. The premises we were to survey, I suppose Swadling was in on this, was actually turned out to be a rather large Greasy Spoon cafe, which presumably the lease was due to expire, and one way or another Robert Maxwell had discovered this and thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity to make a presence on the university scene in Manchester. You can imagine the interior. It was absolutely packed when we arrived there, full of people eating their lunch, students, people off the building site, etc., etc. Excuse me. Thick blue smoke, of course, as would we go with the scene at that particular time. The individual who met us there was an academic, rather than nervous individual, a little on edge, I thought. I don't know how old he'd be, sort of early 30s. It became fairly obvious to me that this was a guy with an agenda. Quite why he was trying to give a rather inept, hard sell, I'm not quite sure. Whether in fact he'd fallen out with Hochland or who knows, but there was certainly an underlying feeling that this wasn't just about getting Maxwell to open a bookshop. Maybe in fact he just wanted to actually curry favour with Maxwell. I don't know, but I did feel in fact there was some kind of hidden agenda here. The mistake he made was very basic. When you're selling to somebody, or negotiating, or any situation where you want a definitive result, the very, very first rule is that you must know who is the decision maker. Now he looks at me, and I'm a kind of rather callow youth, and look much younger. I would be 23 years old, and looks at Swaddling, who much taller than me, and a mature man. And of course he assumes that Mr. Swaddling is, of course, the person to aim his repartee at. In this he was mistaken. Anyway, we looked over the place, and this guy gave us the rundown. And in fact, I did remember that he actually mentioned Hagen Hochland as being rather an inferior bookshop. I don't really know what the situation was here, or why he was upset with Ernest Hochland, but you know, he obviously wanted another competitor on the scene for reasons of his own. So we look over the place and say our goodbyes, and we get in the car and we head back to Oxford. I duly wrote a report. It was a reasonable idea, but the problem was, in terms of location, it was slightly away from the main site of action, as it were, and retailers of any kind spend a great deal of time measuring footfall to see whether in fact it's worthwhile opening any kind of business on the high street or wherever. And it was apparent to me that in fact, you know, this would end up, unless it really could offer something very special, a second choice bookshop, just because of geographical location. We also have to bear in mind that in fact Robert Maxwell was not exactly the darling of the academic establishment, as I discovered later on, sometimes to my cost, when I eventually founded the bookshop at Lancaster University. And so, bearing this in mind, and the quality of Hagen Hochland, and as I say, the geographical location, which I think was, was not advantageous, I basically advised that perhaps, okay, you could do it, but in fact, you really had to consider the downsides. I duly typed this out and sent it off to Robert Maxwell, and that's really the last I heard of it. But it was one of the things of working with Robert Maxwell. It was a bit like playing a gigantic game of bingo. You never really knew when your row of numbers were going to come up. In recent years, I got to know quite well and actually worked with a colleague actually on European Union projects, the man who had actually been the editor of the European. And in fact, he kind of confirmed these kind of impressions I had of being a minion in the Robert Maxwell organization. If you've enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please subscribe.